All right, let's talk about something that's, well, pretty sensitive. It's a topic that's almost never discussed out in the open, and honestly, it can make people uncomfortable the second you even bring it up. We're going to take a look at some psychological patterns that are all around us, but that we rarely, if ever, talk about.
And you can probably feel why, right? The moment a subject like this comes up, the defenses go up. It feels personal, it can sound like an attack, and it definitely pushes a lot of buttons.
But here's the thing. Ignoring something just because it's uncomfortable doesn't make it go away. It just leaves us kind of blind to how things really work sometimes. So we're going to be looking at some psychological ideas that are very real, whether we like them or not.
So before we get into the weeds, let's be super clear about our goal here. We are exploring psychological patterns. These are broad, observable human behaviors. This is absolutely not a personal attack on any single person or on an entire gender. That distinction is so important to keep in mind as we go through this.
Okay, so to really have this conversation in a meaningful way, we need a good framework. And for that, we're going to borrow a concept from psychology called the shadow side. It's a part of every single one of us, and understanding it is really the key to this whole topic.
So think of it like this. Every group of people has a light side, the qualities we all admire, things like empathy or the ability to connect. But we all have a shadow side too. These are the unconscious strategies that can get a little destructive. And here's the crucial part. Ignoring your shadow doesn't make you a good person, it just makes you blind.
So when we use a phrase like the dark side, we're not talking about evil, not at all. We're talking about these deep-rooted survival strategies. These are behaviors that evolved for a reason, to protect us. But they can really become destructive when they're running on autopilot, totally unchecked and unconscious.
So let's start with the first big pattern our source material points to. It's an incredibly powerful tool called emotional leverage.
The key word on this slide is instinctive. This isn't some comic book villain sitting there stroking a cat and plotting their next move. No, this is about a deep, almost automatic understanding of emotional cause and effect. It's knowing on a gut level how your words or your silence or your affection can completely steer a situation.
And this right here really shows the two sides of that coin. When that emotional intelligence is used consciously with good intentions, it builds amazing, powerful connections. But when it's used unconsciously, without any self-awareness, it can turn into this really subtle but really powerful form of control. People can find their behavior being shaped by it and not even have a clue what's going on.
Okay, so that leads us right into the next pattern. It's this idea of handling conflict not by facing it head-on, but by using what psychologists often call indirect aggression.
So instead of a direct, hey, I have a problem with you, influence gets applied socially. It can start with just a small disagreement, but then it might morph into subtle little acts of exclusion, then some quiet damage to that person's reputation, and before you know it, they're completely isolated from the group. It's so much quieter than a big fight, but the fallout can be way more damaging.
And that's what makes it so tough, because it's also indirect. The person on the receiving end just feels this creeping sense of isolation, this confusion, but they can't put their finger on a single thing and say that was an attack. It's almost impossible to defend yourself against something you can't even clearly identify.
All right, now we're getting to what our source identifies as probably the most controversial piece of this puzzle. The dynamic where perceived vulnerability can actually be flipped and used as a form of power.
Let's break that down. In certain social situations, being seen as the one who's hurt or fragile or wronged can actually become a strategic tool. It's a way to shift responsibility off of yourself, to completely shut down anyone who might criticize you, and sometimes to totally flip the script on who's actually accountable for what happened.
Now again, and this is important, we're talking about a pattern, not a universal law of human nature. But the argument here is that just pretending this dynamic doesn't exist because it's uncomfortable to think about, well, that doesn't really help anybody. It just leaves a big blind spot in our understanding of how people work.
So, we've looked at some pretty difficult patterns, and you might be sitting there thinking, where does all this come from? Is it just bad? Well, here's the twist. Here's the big reframing of this entire topic. The source of these behaviors isn't malice, it's survival. I mean, think about it from an evolutionary standpoint. These strategies, emotional leverage, indirect aggression, are incredibly effective ways to protect yourself and get what you need in situations where, say, physical force isn't an option. The dark side really only shows up when those old survival programs get misapplied, unconsciously, in our safe, modern world, where they're not about survival anymore, they're about control. And that brings us to what might be the single most important takeaway from all of this. The thing we perceive as a danger isn't female psychology. The real danger for every single one of us is unconscious psychology. It's what happens when any of us act out these ancient survival patterns without awareness, without empathy, and without taking responsibility.
So look, if watching this made you feel a little uncomfortable, that's okay. It's totally understandable. In fact, the source material would suggest that that feeling is often a sign that we've touched on something true, even if it's a truth we'd rather not look at.
And that really leaves us with one final big question to think about. Is it better to drag these psychological shadows out into the light, even when it's uncomfortable, so we can understand them, or are some topics just too sensitive, and maybe we're better off just leaving them alone?